My name is David Kaib. I'm one of the organizers of the Night School. My pronouns are he and him. And the Metro DC DSA Socialist Night School is a series of sessions that explore basic ideas, concepts, and historical events related to socialism. While everyone is welcome, these sessions are especially designed for those newer to socialism and to DSA and to the topics covered. Our night school was based on the notion that organizing and political education are not properly understood in tension, but are rather mutually reinforcing. If you have any problems with the audio or with the video, you can let us know in the chat. And we're going to try and leave time for questions at the end. So you should be able to put those in the Q&A box at any time. Tonight's session is going to be led by Silky Shah, who is the executive director of the Detention Watch Network, a national coalition building power to abolish immigration detention in the United States. She's worked as an organizer on issues related to immigration detention, the prison industrial complex, and racial and migrant justice for nearly 20 years. Welcome, Silky.
Thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here.
All right. So tonight we're going to be doing a little bit of a conversation between Silky and I, but mostly me asking some questions and then hearing from our session leader tonight. So the first question I wanted to ask is to lay a little bit of historical foundation for our conversation. So what are the origins of the systems of immigration, policing, and detention in the US? And how have those systems changed over time?
Yeah, small question to start us out. So yeah, it's really great to be here. You know, as David said, I'm with Detention Watch Network, and it'll come up in the sort of history as I tell it, but we are actually celebrating our 25th anniversary this year because 25 years ago, we had some really, or around 25 years ago, we had some really bad policies put in place in immigration law. But I'm going to start a little further back. I think there's this sort of narrative around immigration, detention, deportation, the machine, just like being worse, especially under the Obama era. And I think actually there's a long history before that of immigrant exclusion, immigrant detention in various forms. And really the sort of recent model that we have is like post 60s, post 80s, and then 90s, and then 9/11. So when you sort of think about like the first immigration detention centers, the two that come to mind often are Ellis Island and Angel Island, which were entry points for people coming from different parts of the world. Ellis Island on the East Coast, Angel Island on the West Coast. And both of those have this sort of, I mean, especially Ellis Island has this narrative of like, oh, this is where people were welcomed into the country, when in fact there was a detention center there. And people were held in the sort of first half of the 20th century. And you know, also there is a lot of history of sort of like some types of policing at the border, like mounted police, other things happening. And then around 1925, we start to see the creation of the Border Patrol. And so those things are starting to happen. The big thing that happens over this period of time is like a major growth in scale and a major expansion of the people who could be impacted by immigration law. So at that point, a lot of people are excluded. And in fact, you know, I think y'all probably know this, there's a lot of anti-Asian exclusion policy out there that says, you know, Asian immigrants couldn't come, a lot of African immigrants couldn't come, certain parts of Europe also. And I think when we think about the different turning points on immigration enforcement, it's important to consider the relationship between it and what's happening in terms of white supremacy and the racial dynamics in the country. So the 1960s is an especially important point. And before I get to that, I will mention Japanese internment was a very specific form of detention, both for citizens and non-citizens during World War II. But again, we don't have this like model of people spending months or years in detention. We have some deportation happening, some really harsh programs like the Bracero program. And, you know, but the sort of systems we have today are starting to take shape actually post 60s. And a few things happen there. And I think it's important to understand immigration enforcement in the context of a lot of the backlash to some of the wins that have happened. So in the 1960s, you see ostensibly an end to Jim Crow in different forms and sort of the civil rights movement. On the immigration side, you also see the passage of the Hart-Celler Act, which is a policy that made it so actually we didn't have national origins quotas. We didn't have really a lot of exclusion for immigrants. And it's the reason why my family came to the US. It's the reason why I was born in the US. And it allowed for people with certain educational backgrounds or family ties to come to the US, and took away the quota system for some places. But it included a quota system for the Western Hemisphere. And the year before that, you also saw the end of the Bracero program. So that's when you start to see actually a lot more undocumented, unauthorized Mexican migrants in the US, and this push to expand Border Patrol. At the same time, with the end of, the sort of end of Jim Crow, like civil rights movement gains, amongst that, with so much uprising happening in the 60s, you saw the sort of growth of the war on crime and eventually the war on drugs. And those things intersecting, actually, you see a lot more expulsions happening at the border. They might not happen in this sort of like formal way that we think about it now, but a lot more people were being moved outside of the US, like voluntary departures, other things sort of forcing them out. And there was sort of this thing where people would be deported, but then come back, and that happened quite a bit. So I think that's an important moment where you see both the US government saying, the federal government saying, we want to put more investment in law enforcement. We want to have a war on crime, and then eventually a war on drugs, but also a growth in, this sort of border dynamic with what's happening with people coming from Mexico because of the inclusion of this quota and these sort of policies to push people out. You fast forward a bit to the 70s and then the early 80s, there is, this is also the height of the Cold War. And a lot of the policies that are sort of coming into play are in relationship to that. So you have this big thing called the Mariel boat lift that happens in 1980, where over 100,000 people came to Florida, and they didn't really know what to do with them, from Cuba, and then some people from Haiti as well. In the context of the Cubans, there was like actually a desire to help them because of the Cold War. It was like, okay, we're going to support these individuals. Though there was a little bit of a question of what you do with the individuals who have past criminal convictions or were committing crimes. Those were sort of questions. And that's actually where you started to see a growth of people in the detention system. For Haitians, the narrative was actually similar to the narrative around Mexicans, where it was like, well, these people are just coming here for their economic refugees. We don't want them. And so actually there was this growth of detention to hold them in particular, and then eventually people from El Salvador. And the early 80s, you start to see this sort of modern detention system form, where you have the opening of the Chrome Detention Center in Florida, which to this day is still used for immigration detention. And, it's not that nobody was detained before that. People were spending less time in detention. ICE didn't have, or INS didn't have its own facilities in the same way. So there was a little bit of a hodgepodge of things happening, but then there became this like very concerted effort to say, we want to mandatorily detain people who are coming to the border, whether they're seeking asylum or for whatever reason. And, we're going to try to figure out how to do this. And they moved forward with it. There was some pushback through the courts. And then eventually they did this thing where they would go ahead and put in policies in place and push for it, and then eventually make them law. So in 1988, and in fact, this is where you still see these like very deep intersections, and you're already starting to see, again, so much more money going to law enforcement, so much more desire for increased prison capacity, et cetera, happening on the sort of rise of mass incarceration in the 80s and 90s. But on the immigration side, they're starting to insert some of this language into these bills. So the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1988 actually included mandatory detention as a provision, and also included this category called aggravated felony, which doesn't really mean anything. It doesn't have to be quote unquote aggravated or a felony, but in the immigration context, it means that you can be detained or deported. So at this stage, they're just sort of setting in motion these laws, putting these laws into place, expanding the detention system. In the 90s, you start to see, again, another rise of people coming, and there's so many things happening at this point, but a rise of people coming. NAFTA is put into place, and more people start coming to the US in the 90s and early 2000s, and more undocumented immigrants in the country. And you also see, the terrorist attack at the World Trade Center and also in Oklahoma City. And so in 1996, there are two laws that are passed that are really the precursor to Detention Watch Network coming into existence. EDPA and IRA, the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act, and the Illegal Immigration and Immigrant Responsibility Act, Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act. And both, what those did, they did a few things. So one, they expanded the scope of who could be subject to mandatory detention and mandatory deportation. They expanded the scope of the number of crimes that could fit under the category of aggravated felony. They completely changed the paradigm, whereas prior to 1996, anybody who was a legal permanent resident, had a green card, wasn't necessarily subject to detention and deportation in the same way based on these policies. But after 1996, they shifted it from resident versus non-resident to citizen versus non-citizen. So it was targeting people who had been in the country for 20 years or plus. And it was retroactive. So you had people who had crimes or other instances, they were coming into contact with INS from the 80s, but then being targeted in the 90s for detention and deportation. So the groundwork is laid, the laws are in place. Like, this is 96, like, starts, so much history of this. There's some seeds of it, all of that's in place. And then 9/11 happens, and you see this consolidation of a lot of different agencies into the Department of Homeland Security to have more power over, quote unquote, in the war on terror, but also to stop immigrants. And so I think when you look at, that's a very long-winded answer to say, like, these seeds have been there for a very long time. But one of the things that was critical is, this way that the executive sort of pushed for different policies, whether it was, Johnson in the war on crime, or Reagan and the war on drugs, and also in the Cold War era, pushing for more detention, and then placing those into law. And then 9/11 is really a moment when you started to see, and prior to this it was happening, but so much more money being funneled in. It was like, we have the laws in place, let's just throw a ton of money at this agency. And that's when you start to see a doubling of detention essentially after that point.
Thank you. So one of the things that's been kind of in the discourse is the real strong focus on ICE, which, as you mentioned before, which, as a number of people have pointed out, is a relatively recent invention. Hasn't been around very long, but it's obviously part of a larger system. So I'm wondering if you could tell us about some of who the other main institutional players are in this immigration enforcement complex.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, that works well with what I was sort of talking about in terms of what happened during that period. You have DHS, and INS has moved from the Department of Justice to DHS, and then is broken out into 3 agencies. So there's Immigration and Customs Enforcement, Customs and Border Protection, and USCIS, the Citizen and Immigration Services, which does more of the naturalization work. So I will try not to bore y'all with this. There's so many agencies. So when you're looking at the executive branch, you're seeing, the Department of Homeland Security. I just laid out those 3 agencies. I mean, Immigration and Customs Enforcement and Customs and Border Protection, CBP, are like the 2 that we really target in terms of the enforcement apparatus. But the Department of Justice is also a critical player in this, and not just because you have the Executive Office of Immigration Review. So the ICE judges, the immigration judges are there. And you also have the US Marshal Service and the Bureau of Prisons, which also play a role in immigrant incarceration for folks who are prosecuted at the border for entry and reentry and other crimes, immigration-related crimes. So that's another entity. So, and they often sometimes interact, sometimes don't, it sort of depends. And then you have Health and Human Services, which is actually the agency that runs the Office of Refugee Resettlement, but also within that, they're the ones who have the sort of purview on young people in the system. So unaccompanied children are there. So when you look at the sort of the system of incarceration for immigrants, they're actually all three of those agencies play a role in that. But I also think it's important to think about some of the other players, and so much of the way that immigration enforcement happens is through the federal engagement with states and localities. So you have the Department of Corrections at every state level that often has some sort of agreement, usually the criminal alien program, with ICE to target people for detention and deportation once they have finished serving their sentence within a state, prison. And then you also have that sort of subset level, which includes sheriffs, so counties and sheriffs. And sheriffs are this like very weird thing where like actually they play such a huge role in the deportation machine, and they vie for contracts. They vie for contracts not just for detention, but also to make their police sort of agents of ICE, and just totally bizarre, and have been such a big part of sort of creating the narrative around anti-immigrant sentiment, especially at the local level. And then you have, local police departments that play a role as well. So it's kind of at so many different levels that immigration enforcement is in the system, which feels daunting, but actually in some ways it's been actually a really effective tool for us throwing a wrench in the system by having these sheriff contracts or other contracts where actually at the local level we have a lot more power than we do necessarily at the national level.
Yeah, we could probably do a whole nother night school just on the sheriffs, but I won't push on that. So under the presidency of Barack Obama, there was a big push for something called comprehensive immigration reform. And also at the same time, as many people noted, there was a sharp increase in deportations. So what does comprehensive reform mean in this context? And what was the connection between these two developments, which on the surface seem like they're pointing in different directions?
Yeah, I mean, comprehensive reform, quote unquote, is something that's like, this is just always how it sort of worked, right? Like even the Hart-Celler Act, which I talked about in 1965, that's sort of like positioned as such a positive reform, or even the Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986, that also is the amnesty bill from the Reagan era. Both of those had so many bad policies in them, and so much that was really harmful. And especially the Reagan bill had this sort of like what we now call E-Verify, this like, employment verification piece. And so it's always this idea that comprehensive reform means we're going to have, if you want some of the good stuff for immigration, you're going to have some of the bad stuff. And what that means sort of has evolved over time. It's actually been really interesting to sort of see. In the Obama era, it was very much, and actually just in general, a lot of the conversation has been about criminalization. And I mean, the 96 bill, there was nothing good that happened in those. Those were both absolutely horrifying. But I think in these recent pushes, especially since the 2006 marches, which, when you kind of saw this modern immigration reform movement, immigrant rights movement build up from, it's so much has been about citizenship, and the framework has been, we need to get citizenship. And then it became not just citizenship, but a pathway to citizenship. So even in these bills, in the 2013 bill, which was like probably the closest we've been to passing something, it was like a 13-year path or something absurd in terms of the path. And it was an interesting, I mean, in some ways, the bill actually addressed some questions on detention. There was some opportunity around mandatory detention and other things. But then before it got to the Senate and they were, before it got like passed out of the Senate, there was this amendment that was attached, a Corker-Hoven amendment that said, actually, we're going to throw all this border militarization money and other things to make this bill okay. And then ultimately it failed. Like it was like, oh wait, we're not going to be okay with this. And a lot of groups still signed on. Detention Watch Network decided we were against the bill because of that amendment. But that's always been the framework. Like if you want something good to happen, you have to make sure whatever else we're doing is deterring migration, is stopping people from coming in every possible way.
Yeah, it's funny how many waves of comprehensive immigration reform we can have that doesn't seem to resolve this issue.
It's kind of over. Like I also think at this point, whenever they bring up CIR, I'm just like, what decade are you living in? Like, this is not actually how things will happen anymore. We're not going to get necessarily a big bill on immigration, and which is why it's so important that we push the executive, because the executive has a lot of authority here.
Yeah. Speaking of the executive, thinking of the shift from Obama to Trump, and ICE officials were very publicly very supportive of Trump, and ICE officials and officers too. And Trump officials talked about taking the shackles off ICE, letting them loose, which is sort of horrifying. But I'm wondering if you can talk about what changed under Trump, both in terms of the politics and the policy.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, I'll talk about this in a future question, but Obama focused a lot on criminalization. That was his thing, right? Like it was the strategy. And then Trump said, no, I just want to focus on everyone. Like, so what sort of happened, and it happened in some ways and then didn't happen in other ways, because actually a lot of groups were successful in fighting back, was more of everything. So more detention, more money, more wall, more of the border wall, more agents, more time that people would spend in detention centers. All of that happened during the Trump administration, especially pre-pandemic, where we started to see a huge growth of detention. The height went up to 55,000 beds. At the end of Obama, it was about 38,000. So it was a significant jump. And, I think one of the big pieces of policy shifts that we started to see, even though there was a lot of it sort of happening late Obama, especially in 2014 when he brought family detention back, was this idea of detention as deterrence, and also these sort of like interdiction models at the border. So the migrant protection protocols, or the Remain in Mexico policy that made it so people had to stay in Mexico while they sort of determined if they could seek asylum, et cetera. And then, as the pandemic started, and now we've supposedly just want to, but are fighting for our lives on this, is Title 42, this like old thing on the books that said, because of public health, we're going to close the border. So in that sense, a lot of it was not just do everything you can to target the people here, but do everything they could to like prevent people from coming. I think that, so that's like the policies. In terms of the politics, one thing I think is really important to talk about is it opened up people's eyes a lot. I mean, obviously there's also family separation and other things, and it was a hard one because it was so bad, but also like, we know that all incarceration is family separation. We know that all deportation is family separation. But one thing that, I think happened was he emboldened ICE officers and Border Patrol agents. Like they became Trump's mob. So a lot of there was this whole period under the Obama administration, we were like pushing for these memos or pushing for ICE to do XYZ or exercise its discretion in different ways. We're doing that now. There are people who are doing that now. I'm not sure if it's the best strategy, but because at some level they've said we actually they believe in Trump. They believe in what Trump believed in. And so, we've only expanded these these agents, and are they actually going to be able to shift their policy when you still give them all this discretion to do whatever they want? And so I think that's a really big question. And it's been a mixed bag, because I think in so many ways Trump took the shackles off, not just for like ICE agents, but also for like all the folks who thought there was some semblance of pro-immigrant sensibility in the US. So actually a lot of more people are paying attention. A lot of states said, no, you can't do this. And that actually reduced interior enforcement. I don't know if we would, we capitalize on this, but even now we're seeing some retreat of the detention system. And I think that's largely because, some of those, our ability to make the case for abolition grew during that period of time. So it's a complicated moment, but I think it, what we did with it was so important.
That makes sense. So you've started to talk about this already, but the next question is about the immigration justice movement and how it's changed over time, and what were some of the challenges that led to these changes, and how did they come about?
Yeah, I mean, there's been so many iterations of the immigrant justice movement. I'll sort of talk, since I'm, like 40. So I'll talk about the immigrant justice movement since the early 2000s, when, again, like this sort of iteration started to take shape, especially after in 2005, the Sensenbrenner bill was put forth that was very anti-immigrant, and it actually sparked a lot of interest from folks. And there was 2 massive marches that happened in the spring of 2006 in response to it. And I think that's when, you started to see a lot more investment in the immigrant rights movement by funders and other folks, and just engagement in general. And then this desire to push for comprehensive immigration reform. I think a lot of the narratives prior to this point were very focused on, for dreamers, I came here as no fault of my own. The framework was very like, we are good immigrants. We are the people who are willing to go into the military and go to college and do all these things, right? And a lot of the narrative, even at the 2006 marches, was, we are not criminals, we are not terrorists, this is the framework. And so that's kind of what we're in. And in fact, the part of the movement that is focused on detention and deportation is quite small, and there's not a lot of investment, there's not a lot of support for it. In the early Obama era, and this is actually when I started at Detention Watch Network, I started in March 2009, so it's been about 13 years, but it was, I think there was a lot of lack of vision, I'll say, on like what we do. I think there was like, oh, Obama's going to make things so much better. And Obama actually, the way that, what's sort of interesting about what his administration did was, their way of making things better was to make people believe that targeting criminals was a progressive reform. So targeting people with criminal convictions. So that what they did was actually take a mess of a system, which was a total disaster under the Bush administration. I mean, it's still a disaster. There's something that works about it, and it's horrible and evil, but it was chaos, and people were transferred left and right. There was over 350 detention centers. Nobody had no idea where their loved ones were in detention. We at Detention Watch Network actually had a map to help people find people in detention. So Obama came in and like made it more transparent, tried to improve conditions, because there was all these reports about deaths in detention. And, at some level that kind of like, when we started to see the deportation numbers go up and the detention numbers go to upwards of 400,000 people a year, we realized we needed to change something about our approach. And that's when we started to sort of think about, I think some of us were there, but it was a process of getting to folks to take on an abolitionist call. But I think on the other side of the movement, there were folks who weren't working on detention as much, who were starting to see their loved ones targeted for deportation and trying to figure out why all of a sudden it went up so much. And it was partly because of an expansion of the 287G program that made local police into ICE agents, partly because the expansion of secure communities that had like a database in local county jails, and then also the criminal alien program, which has like ICE at all these different jails and prisons across the country. And they were sort of forced to understand that. They're like, oh, actually, the reason why my loved one is being targeted is because of the criminal justice system. So there's all like both this, it sort of forced people to say, actually, we can't just ignore mass incarceration. We can't ignore the criminal punishment system. We have to kind of see how it intersects. And for the most part, a lot of it was like, hey, let's remove these things. But I think now people understand, actually, we need to like take it all down. But I think that was key. I think the other thing that's happening during this era is the uprisings in Ferguson, the growth of the Black Lives Matter movement. So then people started to understand, like the immigrant rights movement really wasn't a racial justice movement, but they understood how race played a role in these decisions. And I think for groups like United We Dream, they were like, actually, we don't want to blame our parents for this choice that they made. We don't want to do this. We want to actually actively work and support our parents and also all these other individuals. And so it sort of forced people to look at things differently. And, you know, I will always put, I mean, it's very, very hard to think about how many horrible things happened under the Obama administration, but I do think us as a movement growing was really critical. And I think at the time, you know, it sort of pointed to me how much abolition was such a central way of approaching these issues, because if we didn't, we would just further entrench the system. And that's a lot of what happened.
Yeah. So part of an abolitionist approach is rejecting the idea that the systems are broken, rather, or that the violence is an aberration, which I think is a lot of the way this is often portrayed. It's sort of violence and lawlessness is somehow, you know, a thing that needs to be explained instead of central to it. And then further than in the abolitionist approach is the idea that these things are working as designed. So if we do accept that the immigration enforcement system is working as designed, if we understand that it's not broken, then how should we understand what sort of system it is?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, I think in some ways, you know, obviously detention is a euphemism, enforcement is even a euphemism, right? Like these are, and a lot of times we say detention because it's just a distinction, but we know it's prison, we know it's jail. And on enforcement, these enforcement programs, oh, what is enforcement? You know, they're just deportation programs. The whole purpose of the system is to exclude people, to deport them, to punish them in some way, to deter. Like, so I think there is this idea about the individual who's being targeted, which is very centrally around punishment and banishment in this way. But it's also designed to deter future migration. So the idea is always, and you know, and now we're again with these interdiction programs and what's sort of happening outside of the US or right outside of the border, or sometimes on the sea in other ways. There are ways that we're preventing people from coming to the US. And I think that is a part of it as well. The Coast Guard's a part of it, right? Like it's sort of all in the mix. So I think in terms of understanding, and this is why we say abolish ICE, which is, you know, a lot of feelings about that in terms of INS was bad too. All of it was bad pre-ICE, right? But it's not, but I think the idea is actually, why do we have a system? Like literally the whole point of ICE is to arrest, detain, and deport immigrants. That's the only reason it exists. And why do we do that? Why are we choosing to do that? And so I think that's an important way to think about it, when there is some idea that these agencies can do good. And, you know, I like on CBP, on Customs and Border Protection, a lot of the framework is like, well, customs is really important. And, you know, what does that mean for agriculture and whatever? All this nonsense comes up. And it's like, that can just happen somewhere else. It doesn't have to happen in this context of a militaristic border. So I think those things are, it's really important to sort of be clear that these systems are designed for punishment, exclusion, and deterrence.
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny because a lot of the time the presumption that there's a problem to be solved is we never ask that question or like think about like defining the problem. It's just, well, everyone accepts that. And then like, what are we supposed to do about it? It kind of skips all those important steps.
Yeah.
So you mentioned a bunch of times this idea of deterrence, trying to keep, essentially these policies are designed to keep people from choosing to come or stopping them from coming. And at the same time, I think it's also true that a lot of US policies help produce that migration in the first place, which is sort of a contradiction. So I'm wondering if you could talk about the root causes of migration and whether that's the right question to be asking. Because I know, for example, sometimes mainstream Democrats will use this. So I think Vice President Harris recently asked that question, but I suspect did so in a different way than we might ask it here. So how does an abolitionist lens change our perspective on that question too?
Yeah, absolutely. It's, there was many years in the immigrant rights movement where we were not allowed to talk about root causes. Like there was polling that said that root causes didn't work. And it was very frustrating because it's like, what do we say then? I think it's a critical question to be asking, especially in the context of US imperialism and colonialism and racial capitalism. I think there's a lot of different pieces to it. So one is, sometimes there's this idea that's like, well, the US is doing harm in this other country. Let's take Afghanistan. And therefore we should accept refugees or people seeking asylum from there. Sure, that's like a very direct correlation. And then there's sort of perspectives on, like, I don't know, like climate or something, like, oh, well, there's a whole bunch of climate refugees and also economic refugees because of NAFTA or CAFTA and these other things that sort of created these harsh conditions. And I think those are all really important to frame. And I think actually it points to a need for, when I think about the immigrant rights movement, a lot of times it's hard because it hasn't been a movement for racial justice and it hasn't been an anti-imperialist movement. Or an anti-capitalist movement. So in so many ways, I think there is a need for the immigrant rights movement to understand our work in a sort of internationalist frame, like what are we doing to push back against harsh US policy. But I think at the other level, like, there is this sort of like narrative, there's sort of two narratives. There's like, migration is beautiful, let's accept migration, it's wonderful that it's happening. And it's like, yeah, sure, sometimes it can be. Or the conditions are so horrifying. Let's talk about how incredibly evil these other countries are, other things are happening, and accept people. And I think at some level, coming back to this sort of point about the US is a wealthy country. People are gonna want to come here regardless forever. Like that is just the reality. And I think, sometimes when we focus so much on root causes, it takes away from like just this desire to like not have borders, to have freedom of movement, to like, so I think there's it's necessary to talk about, but I think it's important to also talk about like a broader vision of the world as we're talking about root causes. And, I do think, the work that we do is very tied to the abolition of the prison industrial complex and sort of how it operates. But I again, the sort of framework of the prison industrial complex came from the military industrial complex and how much we actually need to like think about our work again as anti-imperialist is so critical in that mix as well.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think there's a lot of things that are important to talk about, but that can end up being like, if you pull them out and abstract them away from all those other big things, then you sort of lose the bite of it and the usefulness.
Yeah, and I think right now it's been a huge challenge. So for instance, with Title 42 and this sort of push by moderate Dems to keep it in place, a lot of the framework is like, what's the plan? What is your plan? Like, it's just this like and it's like, and then immigrant rights folks end up getting caught into this like framework that's like, well, actually, all these other horrible things are still happening. So if you think that, and it's just bad. And at some level, what we so need to do is actually like lead with vision in all of these instances, because when we don't, we end up with like even worse policy.
Yeah, it's hard on this one because it's so transparently not transparent nonsense that they don't care. They don't seem to care about the pandemic in any other way except
Right.
for as a justification to deport people. So that's fun.
Of course, yes.
So another kind of element, kind of thinking through from the abolitionist perspective, is a focus on the question around harm, which is, again, as I said, is often kind of the one that doesn't get asked. It's just about the presumption that these systems must be addressing harm, or, that sort of thing. But so I'm thinking, first of all, what are the sort of claims that are made about the harms of migration that are used to justify the detention system, deportation, and things like that? And then also, are there real harms from migration, either to migrants, their home communities, to those of us who are already here? And then especially, what are the harms of the immigration enforcement or, immigration punishment itself?
Yeah. I mean, I think there's like the deeply racist and framework that Trump put forward about the harms of migration that justify detention. I'm not going to talk about those because I don't think that that's necessarily useful. But I do think that the thing that we do have a challenge on, especially in the context where the detention system has become a part of the political economy of a lot of rural communities, is this sort of framework of stealing jobs or stealing benefits. For instance, whenever you hear about the public charge rule, a lot of that is about immigrants taking from benefits that citizens would usually have. And I think in both of those instances, we have to sort of lead with an abundance mindset instead of a scarcity mindset. And I think that's something that's really hard for people to do because they don't think in that way, because the society doesn't tell you to think in that way. So I think we have to sort of work on that, especially in the context of these rural prison towns that don't want to end detention or end these prisons. It's like, well, what else can we do? Are there other investments that can happen in these rural communities? Why is this happening there? Or maybe thinking about the jobs guarantee, other things that can actually move away from this model where the carceral state is the thing that they're dependent on. In terms of harms from migration, I mean, I talked about this a little bit in terms of, this framework of migration is beautiful versus you are in the most dire conditions and you have to leave, and sometimes it's somewhere in between, or sometimes it's other things. And I think there are people who want to move, there are people who don't. Like, displacement, though, is something that we don't want, right? We want to move in a direction that is making it so if people want to stay, they're free to stay, if they're free to move, and also free to thrive. I think that's the thing that like kind of gets lost in the mix, is people's ability to be in the best conditions, because there's a lot of undocumented folks in this country who are just living day to day, feeling the fear of detention or deportation, or just feeling the sort of sense of second class status in this country. And that's not to say that citizenship is the end all be all, because we know it's not, but I do think that it is quite difficult for people. And then in terms of harms of immigration enforcement, I mean, I think that actually gets to sort of like thriving piece, but also, I mean, so much reinforcement of trauma, there's so much that's horrible that happens in detention centers. So it's not just, so it's both like while you're in detention, the treatment that you have, some people die, really, really harsh conditions. But then also, the act of deportation is such an inhumane act. And so I think, there's like nothing good that happens through immigration enforcement. And I think we need to remember that.
Yeah, and as you mentioned before too, you get the sort of racist scarcity mindset, which then, you have these rural communities, for example, who maybe have all sorts of other needs, but it's sort of like, no, here's the one thing you can maybe have. And it would be much better if we could say, well, they just said there's a pot of money for this. What else might we use it for?
And it's so easy to blame. Like, I mean, people just think so individually in the US, right? And are very ahistorical. And so there's like, it's so easy to just like blame an individual or a group of people, but not blame these corporations that have like taken money from, and like the people who aren't paying taxes or doing XYZ, there's just so like the billions that, I have like a family member who worked at Walmart and she was like getting mad about something. I was like, you should be mad at the CEO of Walmart instead of this other individual. Like, what is going on there? And so I think there's also that real challenge. It's a paradigm sort of shift that's going to take a lot of work.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, then how should abolitionists think about immigration reforms? How can we tell the good reforms from the bad?
I think the easiest sort of lens is like, are you building up, is this reform going to build up something that you're then going to have to dismantle? That's like, is it, I think in the current context, we're actually winning on some detention. A lot of the framework that people put out there is, well, look at how bad incarceration's gotten. And it's like, well, for a long time, detention was increasing, incarceration, like GPS monitoring was increasing, and now we're seeing like a reduction here. So we have to own that win. That's really important. But yeah, the reason we're seeing the incarceration grow is that there's still this idea that some alternative to detention needs to exist. And we will have, we want to dismantle that. And so I think it might be a little easier to dismantle than something else. So it's also those sort of considerations come into play. And I also think there's this sort of point around what further entrenches the system. So one of the big pushes that's out there right now from immigrant rights groups is for universal representation. So representation of everybody who's going through removal proceedings. And the idea, there's different models of this. One where, you might have a locality, New York City, that says we're going to fund representation for all residents of New York who are immigrants in deportation proceedings, or it might happen at the state level. There is a push for it to happen at the federal level. And there's a lot of concern from folks who are abolitionists about this, largely because, in the criminal punishment system, when you think about post-Gideon, which is the law that makes it so people can have public defense, you actually see the rise of public defense and the rise of mass incarceration happen together. So there isn't actually a correlation in that actually impacting whether people are going to be incarcerated or not, because that's so much about the laws and there's only so much a lawyer can do. And in the immigration context, like they don't have to do any of this. Like it's a civil proceeding. Like they like, so ICE currently play, or like, I guess the government currently pays for prosecutors to target people for detention and deportation. And now we're asking them to pay for defenders to defend people for immigrant, detention and deportation, when they could just not have both and stop targeting people for the system. And I think, if you put it in the federal system, then it just reinforces this idea. And, all these people are dependent on these legal jobs that eventually we hopefully won't need. And so I think that's actually it's a big contentious conversation in the immigrant rights movement right now. And I think, or at least like my small nerdy part of it, but I do think that, those are hard questions for us. And I sort of come on the line of, at the local and state level, I think it could be interesting because people need support. And that still opens up space for like shifting the power dynamics to push for federal reforms. Whereas if you do it in the federal system, it sort of entrenches the whole thing. And that's really concerning. So yeah, we have actually like a chart that we put together that sort of says, here are some abolitionist steps versus reformist reforms. And I think, those conversations continue to evolve. Oh, great. Yeah. Yeah. And I think some of them are really obvious. It's like, if you're just going to focus on conditions, that's really not going to get us anywhere. But other ones are a little harder. And I think, I think there's been a lot of tension around detention center closure as a lot of people think, well, if you do it in one place, are you just going to end up having detention in another place? One, we're actually seeing that's not totally the case. Two, you need to build power. So it becomes a nuanced argument. Like it is so much about how we build power as a movement when we think about these issues as well.
Yeah, and I just put that link in the chat. So I recommend checking that out. One question I had is, it's always interesting because a lot of well, a portion of the right-wing types will say, oh, it's not that we're against immigration, we're against illegal immigration. And it's always struck me that if that, I mean, obviously they're lying, but if it was truly true, like, okay, then like give people papers. Like if the problem is people are undocumented, like why, and as you pointed out, like this was essentially a thing of having this like large group of undocumented people that practically happens overnight because the law changes about who needs papers. So it's always fascinating to me that we can't, and somehow like that's off the table. It's like, well, if that was the problem, then that's easy to solve.
It is and it isn't, but it's also like, this is how the US functions, right? It functions on undocumented labor. It functions on the ability to pay people very little and not have very little protection, very little workers' rights. Like, and it has this sort of like, mutual relationship with Mexico in this way that the US benefits from that. And so it might not be that people are explicitly thinking about those things when they're making those decisions, but I think that's part of it. I think there's also this deep sort of fear that if you make all these individuals have the ability to have voting power, what does that mean? And I actually think, like, in terms of as we move forward and sort of think about where things go, I do think this question of like voting for people who are immigrants who might not be citizens in municipal elections or other things could actually be really interesting and have real impacts.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that non-citizens have the right to vote in Tacoma Park, which is not far from where I am.
Yeah.
Okay, I have to move my cat so I can read my last question. So I think one of the challenges that you've kind of gestured towards is that a lot of the various movements around policing, around immigration, among others, are siloed, that they're separate in terms of, or often in terms of the activity, in terms of the way the problems are conceptualized. This sort of just seems like a standard way of sort of policy analysis, is to pull things that are very related apart and treat them as all they're these independent pieces. So particularly when it comes to immigration and criminal punishment, how do we overcome that sort of siloing, and what sort of strategies do you see as important here?
Yeah, I mean, I think, a lot of my lens often is with the immigrant rights movement and pushing it to not just like reinforce criminalizing frames. I think that's like really key. But when I think about the silos, we've, in the last year, almost a dozen county jails have stopped being used for ICE detention. And that's because of the immigrant rights, or because of the movement to end immigration detention, specifically. And we've really been successful, and all those jails continue to remain open and continue to incarcerate people. So like the thing is, like, yes, we won really big. This jail in Etowah that many of us have been fighting for over a decade is now no longer going to be used for ICE detention, but it still exists, and it's still a horrible place. And so I actually think, there's the No New Jails Network. There's a set of folks who are really considering this question around pretrial detention. And actually it was really interesting at the beginning of the pandemic, because people started to say, well, why do we have, hundreds and thousands of people in jail pretrial who aren't serving time for anything? So I actually think there are both lessons that can be learned from the fight against immigration detention and how we've been able to move that. And again, a lot of these counties also have contracts with the US Marshals. And taking those fights, and I think this will happen in Alabama with Etowah, actually, people are fighting the jail generally. And I think, how do we like build on some of these fights to ensure that there are ways we can reduce the capacity of those jails or do something to shift? I think that's one intervention I'm thinking about a lot, because I think it's really hard to think about these jails continuing to remain open and people continuing to be incarcerated in them. I also think that there's a real need for us to make sure that the stories that we're telling is not about from this frame of like this innocent person and they're deserving for all these reasons, but just be like, actually, there's harms that have happened. I think Survived and Punished does this amazingly well. There's harms that have happened to these individuals. They end up in the system, and then there's a sort of double punishment happening on immigration, and those give us opportunities to sort of bridge the gap. But yeah, I think especially at the local level on bail reform, on sentencing reform, other things that are happening, there's actually a lot of connection to be made.
Yeah. I'm glad you've kind of come back repeatedly to this really important point around like the notion of criminality and like the idea of the criminal. And I think about this one a lot because it seems like it's that idea is a really powerful tool for like undermining the sort of good things we might want. And so I'm thinking about your point about Obama's administration using criminalization as like, oh, we're only targeting the criminals, as an alleged progressive thing, when actually it helped for this massive expansion. And I'm also thinking about Angela Davis, and I don't remember the exact quote, has a line about how the idea of the criminal does the ideological work of explaining why we have this large class of people who, we don't have to worry about their needs and, the way they're treated. So it ends up just being this gigantic carve out from sort of things. And it can sit comfortably with universal claims, right? So you can sort of say, oh, everyone should have this. And like, there's like this little imaginary asterisk, except all the criminals, which is this gigantic number of people.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And, I think that was what Trump was speaking to in his way of approaching, it's so pervasive. It's sort of incredible. And the truth is, like, for so many of these politicians, like, it benefits them both politically and economically to have people who are quote unquote criminals.
Mm-hmm. So we have some questions already in the Q&A. So this is the point when we're going to ask you to put your questions in there. I will read them out. I have some more of my own, but we have a few in here that I'll start with. And so the first one is, do you see a trend where America is shifting its enforcement agenda to Mexican authorities, such as the crackdown we've seen on migrant camps by Mexican authorities?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's not a recent trend. It's actually just like been ongoing and it continues on. And then there's like, how do we build the border between Guatemala and Mexico even more? How do we have these quote unquote safe third country agreements and other things? So in every single way, I think, and this is a really hard thing for those of us who work on immigration detention, because there is a long narrative around detention as like shelter, and like, oh, people come here and they're in detention while they're figuring out that, and so at some level, people think if we get rid of detention, there's going to be more interdiction models, but like all those things aren't correlated. Like they just don't want people to come, and having detention space is not the thing that's going to help more people come. It's us actually making the case and pushing against these policies. And it's really hard with sort of asylum policy, because the framework is like, well, it's international law, and like nobody cares about international law, like nobody cares about human rights, like that doesn't work here. And so I think we have to, like, again, move towards things that are going to demilitarize the border, have less funding going to these really harsh programs, and push for policies for people to come. And like, I don't know, I do think that, again, we're in a moment where actually we need to do a lot more work on our vision on these pieces if we're going to have an impact.
Okay. The next question, and apologies for my pronunciation. What are your thoughts on organizations such as Pueblos Sin Fronteras that organize the caravans?
Yeah, Pueblos Sin Fronteras. I don't have like I'm not sure if I can totally answer that. I haven't been like paying attention to as much of their work. I know some of the folks who have been involved in that work. I think, I think it's important to offer support and accompaniment as we can to people who are trying to seek safety. And if that's something that is happening, I think that's not a bad thing.
So I believe you mentioned the airport protests that happened under Trump,
Oh
and I
yeah.
wanted to kind of go back to that for a second
Yeah.
because it was a fascinating moment, and it felt for a lot of people, I think, like the first moment when like there was a kind of successful pushback around Trump, both because he had this sort of big mobilization and it actually was able to stop up the system, at least for a little bit. I'm curious about like what your thoughts on that and like what were the lessons that we should draw from that, if any?
Yeah, no, I think it was a moment when it showed that actually like there is so much possibility for us to be able to have mass mobilization and organizing. There is so much more possibility than we might believe. And obviously, summer of 2020 was another big moment, and there have been actually more than in the last decade than I anticipated being, but it's amazing. And so I think with the airport protests, I think there was sort of, it was interesting because in the sense there was like, hey, people are taking stands, bodegas, taxi drivers, all these people, like ordinary people were saying, we're not gonna like be complicit in this. And that was so important. But then part of the thing that happened that's sort of hard about it is that in the context of the Muslim ban, actually, they just started revising the Muslim ban in different ways, and it stayed in place in different ways because of that. And the narrative, and I remember this so well, like after the airport protests, it was like, our savior is the ACLU. Our savior is this organization that is going to litigate, and we're going to have the New York Times spread, and we're going to get $24 million to the ACLU to do their thing. And so we didn't do the work to say, actually, what does it mean for popular uprising to happen, and how do we use that to sort of build this like broader case against Islamophobia, against the war on terror. And I think the summer of 2018 is also a similar example where during the family separation crisis, similarly, oh my gosh, family separation is happening. Let's give $20+ million to Raices to do legal service provision for these people who are, it's just like, no, this is not going to be the impact. So I think, again, we're in this place where sometimes, because liberals are so obsessed with the courts and so obsessed with the idea that the Supreme Court and the courts are going to be our saviors, there's a lot of investment there as opposed to investment in base building and popular organizing. And I think the summer of 2020, and you know, there's a lot to be sort of examined about BLM and other things, but I will say, there was something to point to there. There was the abolition, the idea of abolition, the steps to abolition that people were putting out, the work that people were, you know, there was a lot that happened, especially as you see, like, you know, I'm in Washington State, Decrim Seattle, or what happened in Minnesota. And I know sometimes people can feel like these things are failures, but actually, like, the needle has moved so much in these contexts, and it's been remarkable. So I think in those moments when there is uprising or there is like a catalyst moment, we have to be, that's why we have to be so prepared for like what we want people to do, because liberals just like, they really think lawyers are going to be our saviors, and that's like, we have to disrupt that in every way possible.
Yeah, and miss that part, you know, judges were much more willing to do things in that particular moment than they were before or after. And so, and then people said like, oh, the tide has shifted. It's like, no, like, we're doing something. We're making that happen. It's not just happening on its own. Yeah.
No, I think that's so key. You know, the 1326, so it's the law that is on the books that says, you know, if somebody re-enters the country twice, they can be incarcerated for, you know, up to 18 months. And if you have a drug conviction, up to 20 years. It's an absolutely absurd law. It's been, you know, in law since 1929, hadn't been like actually prosecuted a ton for many years, and then a bunch of money was funneled into the system, horrible programs like Operation Streamline, and then you had like thousands and thousands of people each year, 90,000 people or so being prosecuted. Last year, a Nevada judge came down and said, actually, and there was great like lawyers and academics working to push on this, but a Nevada judge came out and said, this law is actually unconstitutional because it's racist. And like a few years ago, prior to 2020, I'm not sure if that would have happened. Like, it's so important to understand that sort of perspective of what judges are doing it's a response to what's happening in the popular discourse and not necessarily like in this vacuum.
Yeah, absolutely. So the next question is, what can we do to, moving forward to abolish ICE?
Well, I think that, I would say I think the best strategy to move towards abolition of ICE is defunding ICE. Like, I think that, us really, really honing in on how we like whittle away on ICE is so key. And then making it irrelevant. So I think what, I actually just wrote a piece on this, hopefully it'll be published soon, sort of considering the two big detention ones we had recently. So they've stopped using the Etowah County Jail, the Glades County Detention Center, and a couple other jails in the South are having like less use. And Biden came out with a budget that had a request for 9,000 less detention beds than in the current fiscal year budget. And I think both of those instances show that we have to have local campaigns that sort of expose the pointlessness, the unnecessariness of ICE, and like people can just be in community. They don't have to be in detention. They shouldn't be deported. And also then go after the money that is injected into it. Like when we do those things in combination, it changes the bigger conversation and also whittles it down the system. So I think that's actually like a really important way of moving forward towards abolition.
Yeah, because the focus on the institution itself runs the risk, as you mentioned, that like at least there were some politicians who were talking in those terms, and it became very clear that they wanted to just take all those functions and move them to other places. I was like, wait, that's not it.
No, and I think that summer in 2018, we weren't really prepared for the abolish ICE moment, and that just goes back to like why political education, our preparedness, like what we're asking people to do has to be really central. And in those catalyst moments, we have to be able to have something to point to.
Yeah. So yeah, remind you if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A. I have one of mine, which is I'm thinking about, you mentioned the Japanese internment, which targeted both citizens and non-citizens. And a lot of the stuff we've been talking about tonight are things, E-Verify and these sort of things are designed to sort out, who the citizen from the non-citizen and who has the authorization versus who doesn't. But I'm just thinking in terms of the work of like on the ground policing, that it's not really a focus on non-citizens because you're just like going on looks. So in that case, it ends up being very, targeting lots of people who themselves, maybe citizens, their family might have generations back. Obviously there's a risk to focus too much on that because you end up saying, well, the problem is targeting citizens, but is there something there that we should be thinking about too?
Yeah, we've mostly avoided it. It happens, but it doesn't happen a ton. Like, I think that a lot of the question around like what we focus on is also like the scale of which something's happening and how much energy we put into it. So I do think it's a good thing to point to expose the problems inherent with the system. But on the reverse, it could say, how do we make this better so that we don't target citizens? So I don't know, it's a complicated thing. And I do think, again, one thing we need to sort of move towards, especially as we think about how much Black American citizens are targeted by police and prisons and working class Americans or people from the US, whatever, are targeted for, being poor and other things. Like, citizenship is not, I just don't know if citizenship is a thing that we should like invest a ton of energy into personally.
Obviously, one of the reasons why people, I mean, there were many reasons why people were very excited to see Donald Trump eventually leave the White House, but one of them was around this issue, the presumption that Biden would be better, and that it might create windows for change. So I'm curious if you can talk about like what has actually changed since Biden took office.
Yeah, so it's interesting. It's funny. If we had had this like a month ago, it probably would have been a much more negative conversation. I will say it's still not very good. But I think the thing that is important to note is that like it's interesting with Biden, because I think there was like for me, it was like a lesson of just like how much it's like actually not about a person, it's about movement. And so Biden became probably one of our most progressive presidents in 40 plus years, which is bizarre to think about because there's so much bad that he's doing, but it's still so much better than some of the horrible stuff that happened. You know, just thinking even recently about the continued extension on student debt, and in those early days of Biden coming into office, it was sort of remarkable to see some of the things that were being put out. So there was this sort of set of immigration enforcement priorities, but also a moratorium on deportations that didn't consider people's past criminal convictions. That was a huge win for the movement. It was quite significant. They didn't fight it, and it didn't go into effect ultimately, but that slight change in the way they approached that was actually quite significant. Also, I mean, they've actually moved ahead with something that Obama put into place around these horrible sort of segregated facilities within the Federal Bureau of Prisons. Are actually starting to shut some of those down, which is really significant. They're exclusively for immigrants. They're all private. And those are actually retreating, and that's a good thing. I think on detention, these recent wins have been remarkable. For 40 years, it's been an upward climb. We're finally going in a different direction. That's huge. Again, this is all movement. If we weren't asking for these things, if we aren't organizing, we wouldn't have gotten them. So I think all those things are important. On the flip side, though, some of it's status quo. Like a lot of it, I think there's like two things. So you have in the interior, this desire to reform ICE agents. I sort of talked about this before, this like, you know, like, oh, can we get the workforce in line and et cetera. And it's just like, no, that's like a total joke. And oh, like, let's have this memo around pregnant women in detention, except that ICE officers still have discretion. Let's have this memo that says they shouldn't target some of these people, but except you still have a whole bunch of discretion to do whatever you want. So I don't think those things are actually the best strategies, and they haven't actually been that effective. And then I think ultimately where Biden has failed the most is 100% on border. I mean, I think in the larger immigrant conversation, I will say, I know I was being dismissive around citizenship. I absolutely believe that we should have citizenship for undocumented folks in this country. But, you know, there was attempts, but also like Build Back Better failed, and that actually hurt so much of his agenda and what progressives were pushing for. And so that's a huge challenge, and speaks to how much power we actually do have and what we need to build. But on the border, it's just been all bad, like all bad in every single way. It's so horrendous. It's so horrifying. And so it's tough. It's tough to like negotiate some of the good stuff with the bad stuff, because we have to acknowledge the wins. We have to have something that helps us keep going as a movement, but then we also have to critique and push back against everything they're doing to normalize the idea that people can't seek asylum anymore. That's what they're doing. They're essentially saying people can't seek asylum anymore. So we're, you know, that's it. That's sort of the name of the game. And so I think the hard part, and I will say, you know, I've been talking about the immigrant rights movement a lot, is that the immigrant rights movement has been actually mostly a movement focused on passing a bill for legalization. It hasn't really been a movement for much else. Now there's, you know, a growing movement against ICE enforcement in the interior, or it grew and it's like there a little bit. So, you know, we're around. And the ICE enforcement in the interior has been successful, especially because they focused on state and local policies. And that's influenced the federal policy. The legalization fight continues to be a really hard one. But there isn't a piece of the movement in the like local organizing and engagement on people who are coming to the US and this sort of need to move away from a, you know, harsh border regime. And I think that's what we need to build more of. It's actually like, if we're going to win on that, you know, all day, every day, we can say it's evil that Biden's doing all these things, but we really need to have both investments there and a growing movement around sort of what we're demanding there. And again, like I said before, I think the movement's in a little bit of a crossroads, because winning on legalization is actually dependent on that.
It is, to me, really fascinating that of all the things to be very bad on, it was the border wall, which just seems like the thing that was so, like, personally, I mean, it's Trump's wall is the way it's always been talked about. And so it's just fascinating that they're like, oh yeah, we're still doing that one.
Yeah, no, it's been a bitter pill. Like, it's been it's really hard. And I don't know, I've struggled a lot with this question, because you know, as we have wins, it's easy to just like fall back into everything so horrible. But I really do believe we have to celebrate some of those wins.
All right. Jose, I think you should be able to ask your question now.
Thank you so much. I am enjoying this conversation so much because I work for the Office of Refugee Resettlement. I'm a case manager. I was a case manager for a EIS site that opened up in California. And I firsthand saw the injustices that minors faced and the psychological harm that minors experienced. But I also saw the harm reduction that EISs and influx sites assisted with. So this conversation of the abolishment of detention has been a really great struggle for me, because first of all, I'm DACA, my parents are undocumented, and I really I always was for like abolishment of ICE, abolishment of all these horrible detentions, but working at an EIS site, I did see like nuances to, like, I feel like there should be like a little asterisk that kind of, I don't even know how to explain myself because I feel so challenged with this question. I would just like to share like little comments that I like wrote down while I was working there. So for those of you who don't know, oh, sorry, how long could I talk for? I don't want to talk like forever.
Couple minutes. We'll give you another minute or so. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Okay, I'll try to make it fast. So EISs were established because there's a great influx of minors coming into the country unaccompanied for many reasons. Either they were separated from their sisters, brothers, other family member, and I totally agree that they should be kept together. And that's something that Congress needs to figure out and like pass a law and change those policies. But I guess for the time being, the EIS sites were acting as an expedited version of releasing children, because the regular shelters that were licensed were not able to hold the capacity of all these minors. So we had to build these EIS sites. So I did see a little bit of harm when it came to like when there were protesters outside of like shut down this detention center. I saw like how I don't even know how to, well, I saw that these expedited versions that we were doing at the EIS sites were actually placing kids in danger, because there is a rise of human trafficking. Many of these kids not all, but a lot of them are being trafficked to work in farms, to work, under this capitalist system that just exploits everyone. And so we had relaxed our policies. Like, we didn't have to do background checks for household members. We didn't have to do fingerprint checks for some of the sponsors. And and I feel like if we abolish the detentions, these policies will even become more relaxed and place some children in danger. I mean, I have way more comments than that, but I want to. Yeah, I'm sorry to all over the place.
Thank you, Jose. It's such a hard question when it comes to kids in custody. I think that so much of the narrative has been focused on getting kids out of CBP custody, which of course all of us want. It's so horrifying. I think the challenge with the influx facilities and also the emergency intake centers are that they're intake sites are that they, like, any amount of time that a kid spends in government custody is harmful. Like, if they shouldn't, like, the goal is to have the least amount of time in government custody. And so a lot of our approach has been focused on how to get to that place of having the least amount of time. And I understand some of those concerns around background checks and other things, but I think sometimes that's also like red tape that is that means that a kid is spending more time. I guess the thing I would say from an abolitionist perspective is, there's a lot of work that we're doing around this in terms of child detention and sort of engaging and figuring out the best way to move away from mass facilities since they are so harmful. But the bigger point here is that we want to move towards a system where actually kids aren't needing to come unaccompanied. Like, how can we actually have a world where parents and kids can come together and then not end up in a family detention center? And I think that, like, ultimately, I think somebody just wrote this in the response, like, having the border, the existence of the border, the existence of these systems actually is what is making your sense of a need for this system. And I think actually, if we move away from these policies, think about ways that actually people can come with their whole families or whoever, be in a situation where they're not having to make that choice is what we need to push for. So I think and this happens a lot with advocates in DC, where it's like, we're trying to solve this like very specific problem, but it misses sight of the bigger picture, which is actually the way the system works is the problem. The way the border functions is the problem. And if we moved away from that, we actually wouldn't have this number of kids coming without accompaniment.
Yeah, one of the things I think about a lot is this notion that criminalization itself makes people more vulnerable in ways that allow them to be exploited. And so on the one hand, with the claim of criminalization is that it's going to protect us. And the only way for that to make any sense, I don't think it really makes any sense, but partly you have to carve out that all the people that are being criminalized are themselves not just harmed by the actual things the government does, but it's a signal to everyone else that this person is someone who doesn't deserve protection. And so I'm thinking about Vicky Law and her co-author's book recently that talked about this, that like when you see someone with that e-monitor on their ankle, that is a signal to other people that this is someone I can abuse and get away with it because they're the criminal, I'm not.
Yeah.
Any final questions in the Q&A before we wrap up? Well, thank you for your question.
No worries, Jose. I appreciate it. Yeah, I think sometimes that's why this is so hard it feels daunting, right? Like it feels like there's too many things to fix. How are we going to go after it? I do think that finding those sort of like specific things to work on, whether it's the budget, whether it's fighting a detention center in your community, whether it's stopping a deportation program, I think those all are really critical. I do think that we have to start like really exercising our arm around demands around CBP and Border Patrol more. I think that actually is the next sort of stage of our work for sure.
Yeah, and those sort of ways of thinking about the problem make it a lot more manageable in terms of, I think that's oftentimes what's missed is that it can look like people accept things or maybe even like things, and sometimes they do, but sometimes they just don't know what to do. And sometimes it's easier to accept things when you don't know what to do.
Yeah.
And so when you have these sort of a campaign where I live, where we're like targeting people that we have access to instead of like the people in, you know, in the federal government, it sort of opens up a lot of possibilities. And the other thing you've talked about a lot is that the narrative around this issue is sort of like, well, this is just the way Americans are. They don't like the illegal immigrant. And what I think the history of this shows is that when contestation has happened, the politics have changed. And so the status quo really depends on that lack of contestation and the belief that the change is impossible, that that's just the way it is.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. It's really, you know, last year at some point, Secretary Mayorkas said there was an overuse of detention, and that wouldn't have happened without a lot of us saying, hey, why are you doing this in the first place? And I think that's the thing, like a lot of these wins are around these convergences with all these people, but the vision is so critical. Calling for abolition is so critical. And having like popular organizing around that is so critical, because you can have all the like nonprofit industrial complex people doing their things or media doing their things and exposing all the things, but it only means so much if we're actually making the case for what we want to see and how we want these things to change.
So do you have any final thoughts for us before we wrap up?
I see there's a couple questions. I'll be quick. I think, you know, yeah, I think I spoke to this a little bit on the job loss pieces. You know, there are different types of investments, like, you know, there are some groups pushing for like USDA investments in local communities through like the Farm Bill that might stop doing detention as much. There is, you know, people pushing for a job guarantee, which actually could really change those dynamics in this country. And then on this sort of second question on sanctuary cities, it seems when they try to push our police officers to not work with ICE, they all tell us that, yeah, so that's, I mean, they're doing this thing right now very much that's trying to repair the framework of ICE. And Mayorkas did something recently where he was like, oh, you know, like mayors and folks stop having all these like anti-ICE policies. We need you to work with us. And it was really quite horrifying. But you know, that's where we've been effective. Like interior enforcement, like, I mean, it is actually down. Like most of the people who are ending up in detention centers who currently live in the US are usually coming from prisons and jails. That's just the reality. It is down because, you know, places like New Jersey and California said, hey, we're not going to allow you to target people at this level. It's limited because there's still people with criminal convictions being targeted, but the truth is that it's significantly down than it was under the Obama administration. And so much of what's happening is about the border when it comes to enforcement. But I do think that ultimately that those like local strategies holding them. So like right now we're in a place, even on Title 42 right now, like we have to defend our wins. We have to keep them in place while we like push for something further. And that's sort of, I think, the way that we need to approach all this. So in the final point, I'll just encourage folks to like, if you want to learn more at detentionwatchnetwork.org, we have a lot of different resources and a lot of different ways to engage. I know there's like amazing work happening for folks who are in the DC area around some of these questions. And we work closely with Sanctuary DMV and Free Them All Virginia and other folks. And I think, yeah, I mean, I think on this question of abolition and immigration, one of my big pushes and one of the things I want to continue to kind of encourage the immigrant rights movement and folks to think about is that, you know, there is this framework that says like, we have to disentangle, like crimmigration exists and we have to disentangle immigration from the criminal punishment system. And that'll be like what we need to do. And I'm like, sure, but actually, when you look at the history, when you look at these systems and how they operate and what's sort of embedded in the psychology of the way these systems work, it is carceral in nature. And the only way we're actually going to get to immigrant justice is if we move towards abolition of the prison industrial complex. And I think that's the way we have to think about that and the lens that we have to use as we move forward with this work.
All right. So thank you so much to Silky. This has been great. I learned a ton. I hope everyone else did too. I suspect they did. I think Andrew might be here and want to talk about some ways that you can get involved. And I should have allowed him to talk now.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Awesome. Thank you again for this wonderful event. I'm always glad when these night schools are put on. I've learned an amazing amount from all of the different ones that happened throughout the year. So I'm Andrew. I'm a member of the Metro DC chapter of the DSA, and I'm specifically part of the mobilization department. So what we do in the mobilization department is try to make it easier for folks to get involved in the chapter, to learn about how they might want to, get involved, or if they just have any questions about, even joining the DSA in the first place. So I just wanted to put a few things in the chat that might help folks out. The first is to the new member orientation / why you should join the DSA. So this is an event that happens every week, Wednesday, 8 to 9 p.m. And it just gives you an overview of what the DSA is and what specifically the Metro DC chapter here is doing in terms of the different working groups and parts of the chapter and how elections happen, all of that great stuff. The second thing that I wanted to just put here as well is a link to Chat with a Comrade, which is an easy way for you to just schedule a conversation to talk to someone from the chapter. If you just want to talk one-on-one and you just have questions that you want to ask, or just hear about what it's like to be involved, you can just go there and then pick a time, and it's really easy. And everyone is super friendly. So, no matter what sort of space you're in, we would love to talk to you. And so I hope you'll find those two links helpful. And thank you again for this wonderful event.
Thank you, Andrew. And then a couple other things from my end. Number one, you can contact the night school team at politicaleducation@mdcdsa.org. I'm going to put all this in the chat. You can also find us on Twitter at nightschool_DC, and in the chapter Slack at political-education, where you can also learn about our rather extensive reading group program. You can find past events that we've held online at the Metro DC DSA YouTube channel. And you can find even more events plus resources at the Night School website. I'm putting that all in the chat. And I hope you can join us for our next event, which I don't know what it's going to be because we got like 4 things in the fire, but nothing's set yet. So, but again, thank you so much for coming. Thanks for your questions. Thank you, Andrew, and thank you, Silky. This has been great.
Thank you so much. Have a good night, y'all.